So this breakout room is in relation to an effective performance at appeal. Hopefully you all have expected that that's the breakout room that you've entered. I won't feel at all offended if you realise that it's not and need to go back to the main room to be diverted elsewhere. But the purpose of this really is just to refresh our memories, I think, in terms of all of the aspects in terms of your preparation for and engagement in an appeal, just so that you can ensure that you get the best result that you can. So by way of agenda then, we're just going to deal with three very short topics. One is writing your evidence. The second is preparing to give that evidence. And then finally, and this is a bit shorter than the other two, delivering your evidence. Now, when you're writing your evidence, you might be panicking a little bit at the outset. There's a lot of pressure on you. It can feel very much like the case is on your shoulders. And you might feel that you're a little bit overwhelmed initially, like this lady here. So that's why I've added that GIF. But at the outset then, what do you need to do? Well, it sounds like a really, really obvious point, but you need to understand your case before you start writing, preferably. Because unless you understand what the case is that your evidence slots into, you may be going down the wrong path. And what I mean by that really is your case theory and where it is that you're trying to get to in terms of result. So you really need to understand how your evidence fits in and where your evidence takes the case as well. So if you're not sure about that at all, you must ask. Hopefully you'll be having conferences with your legal representation beforehand, you should do. And you can discuss those sorts of elements there, although we obviously can't coach people when it comes to giving evidence, and we can't write your evidence for you. We can give you a steer and explain what the case is so that you understand, and we can look at proofs of evidence and so on if instructed as well. So make sure you understand what that is. In terms of a starting point, obviously have a look at the reasons for refusal. That's your go-to in terms of understanding where you're starting at. Look at the reasons for refusal that fit with your area that you're covering. Obviously a bit easier if you're dealing with the planning evidence because you're tying everything together. But if you're dealing with a specialist subset, so for example, the heritage reasons for refusal, you'll need to work through and work out which are that you're dealing with. An expert duty. Obviously, you need to remember your professional code of conduct here. Whilst there can be a lot of pressure placed on you to make sure that your evidence fits the theme and aims of your client, it's really important to remember that you have to be objective and you have to be independent. So your duty is to the inspector and the inquiry, and you need to make sure, therefore, that whatever evidence you're giving is your genuine professional opinion, not your client's. Those two can, of course, tally. They can be the same. But if you disagree with anything, then you need to be honest about that. And if the extent of your disagreement is such that it causes issues for your client's case, it's obviously imperative that you let them know as soon as possible about that. In terms of layout, well, London AZ map here, I have to say, I was thrilled that the invention of the sat-nav came before I was driving in earnest, because I'm not really a fan of stopping and looking at my A to Z, I have to say, but neither am I the sort of person to blindly drive into a ditch. So you need to make sure that you're not doing that with the inspector either. Don't take the inspector into a ditch. Don't take them off on a diversion that you don't want them to go on. You need to make sure that your evidence is really logical and chronological in nature. So what that means is making sure that you've got a really clear plan and you're telling a story effectively. You need to bear in mind that although the inspectors are professional, they don't know this case, and whoever's evidence is the easiest to navigate is going to stick out more in the inspector's mind. So the typical layout really then, your qualifications and your experience at the outset, moving to talk about the site, then the planning history insofar as it's relevant. You then want to focus on what this proposal is really about, looking at the test that you need to meet. Then you go to your development plan policies and pick out those that are key and talk through those in general. And then moving through to your MPPF, MPPG, and so on. You'll want to look at any emerging policies and deal with those as well. Consider consistency with the MPPF, because of course a lot of us have old development plans, and we need to therefore address our attention to the extent to which there is consistency or otherwise. and then move through the proposal itself and apply those policies to it, or vice versa. Now, in terms of how you do that, it really depends, I think, on the extent of the proposal. Sometimes it will be a lot easier for you to go through on a topic basis. So, for example, if you've got a 5-year issue, then you might want to deal with that after you've dealt with policies. So you're laying the landscape. If you've got lots of different reasons for refusal, it might make sense to have different subheadings that work through that. But once you've gone through those introductory phases that I've mentioned, your bulk is really dealing with how you're addressing the proposal. Then you need to go through your other material considerations and any benefits of the proposal, and then you've got your planning, balance and conclusion at the end. Obviously, bear in mind that if this is a larger development and your proof is therefore quite long, you obviously need to look at doing a summary proof as well. So you want that also to be very logical, very easy to read, and picking out your key points. Obviously, be persuasive. We want to be telling the inspector that this is the evidence that he or she needs to really grasp and move forward with, that our evidence is preferable to our counterpart's evidence. So what we need to be convincing the inspector of is why our opinion should be the one that's preferred. Okay, so look at what the other side's position is. Obviously, at the point that you're dealing with your evidence, you won't have their proof, but you'll have their statement of case, you'll have an indication, and think about why they're wrong about their position. Try and give the inspector a really simple route through to the answer and back up your rationale for that as well, with as much evidence as you can to do that. So really, really important. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. You're the expert in this. This is your opinion. You make it absolutely clear why your opinion is the best opinion. Now, preparing to give evidence. If you've not watched Suits, I think you're sorely missing out. You can watch it all on Netflix. Not that this is an advertisement, of course, but during lockdown, not a bad task to undertake. And for those of you that have watched Suits, you'll know that the character here, Mike, has a photographic memory. Now, I wish I had a photographic memory. I don't. But the point is here that when you're preparing to give your evidence, you want to make sure that you have absorbed as much as you possibly can, may not be photographic, but as much as you possibly can, to ensure that whatever it is that you're asked, you have a route through to an answer. So again, you need to know your case. You need to reread that statement of case, the statements of common grounds, because obviously matters may have moved on. Reread all of the evidence in the case, and if you are not sure about anything at all, you need to ask your legal representatives, maybe your manager, whoever it is that would be the most sensible and relevant person to ask, just to be clear, particularly because on larger projects there can be a lot of developments, particularly where there are negotiations throughout. So you need to make sure you know where you're at. Obvious point, you need to know your proof. We've got a gentleman here who unfortunately got the absolute wrong answer on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you don't want to be giving the absolute wrong answer to the inspector. So know your proof, but also know your counterpart's proof as well. Know what the strengths are in your evidence, but also the weaknesses, and how are you going to respond to those weaknesses? Because if you don't think about this all in advance, you're only going to be asked the question from the counsel at inquiry anyway. So make sure that you're really, really clear as to what you might say. And that might sometimes mean that you're looking at what concessions you might make. Concessions, of course, can sometimes be sensible if once you've seen the evidence that the other side's raising, it makes sense to you. You know what they're saying. It may be that you do need to make a concession in your expert opinion. Your view may have reasonably changed, but what you do need to do is think through a logical rationale for your change in opinion or the concession that you're making. And you also, I think, before you make any concessions at all, you need to think about the consequences of that concession. Where does it now take the case to? Does it change things? Does it change things drastically? If there is anything particularly drastic about your change in opinion or a concession that you'd wish to make, you need to let your client know as soon as possible, because obviously if it impacts their case, they will need to be aware of that and be able to tackle it. So think about all of those things in the preparation stage. Personally, I think that the writing the evidence and the preparation stage are to some extent the most key, because if you put all of that work in there, By the time it comes to giving evidence, which is usually the bit that everyone's the most terrified about, you won't need to be terrified anymore because you will know everything. And that then comes on to knowing the bundle. And again, it sounds like a really, really obvious point, I'm sure, but you need to just read, tab any key documents, anything that relates to your evidence in any way. So not just anything that's linked to your own appendices, or indeed your counterparts, but if there are any other documents, any policy documents, maybe even any letters that have been written in, anything that relates to what it is that you want to say, tab it. I've said here highlighters are your friend, but I've said maybe just an acquaintance. You don't want to be too friendly with your highlighter, because the last thing you want in the middle of giving evidence is to look down, think that you're going to have a lovely highlighted passage, and then realise you've, in your panic, highlighted the entire page. You won't be able to pick out your point. And you need to think about how those documents in the bundle really link to your proof of evidence as well. And it's really important, actually, because when you're giving evidence, if you're asked a question, what you want to be able to do is go to the bundle to support any answers that you're giving. It's also a fantastic way to give you a bit more time to think about your answer. If you know that there is a document in the bundle that helps with what it is that you want to say and is relevant, just noting that whilst you're giving your evidence and giving that time to go to that document can be really key in terms of collecting your thoughts together. It also, in my view, and I'm sure you'll understand why, gives the impression that you as a witness are on top of your case. If you're someone who can with ease move through the bundle, it looks like you've really considered your opinion, you've really thought about it, you know what the documents are, you know what all of the information is, there's nothing that you've overlooked, and that has to be compelling before an inspector. If you're an expert that can do that, compared to potentially your counterpart not being able to do so as well. And then finally, forearmed is forewarned. So how is your evidence being given, I think, is the first thing to think about here. And I've mentioned in brackets here Rosewell. I'm sure you're all aware that there's more and more of a move towards evidence being given in a round table session. That's obviously entirely different to your traditional form of giving evidence, where you give your evidence in chief with your barrister and then you're cross-examined by the other side. So you need to think about that, because that might change how you prepare and how you plan to answer any of the sticky points that you think are there when you've looked at all of the evidence after proofs are exchanged. You also might want to think about, if you're having a virtual inquiry, for example, how that might impact the way that you would want to give your evidence, even if it's just from a technological perspective. If there's any documents you might want to share, say for example, if you're the landscape witness, you might want to share certain views or certain plans, and you'd need to make sure that you're comfortable with doing that and it doesn't break up the way in which you would usually feel comfortable with giving your evidence. So that's really important. But also think about what you'd like to touch on. Now, if you are giving evidence in a more traditional sense, in chief, that can be a really useful tool for building on your proof of evidence and dealing with some of the trickier bits in the other side's evidence. It's always a lot more comfortable dealing with those tricky points with your own barrister rather than in cross-examination. So think through what it is that you might want to clarify or add in your evidence and let your barrister know about it. What I always find really helpful is an examination in chief note from witnesses, where they will give me bullet points, even if it's just their top 10 bullet points that they'd like to be able to draw out from their examination in chief, because then it's a lot easier for us to ensure that those things are covered, and also to make sure that you're dealing with your difficult points in a nicer way. In terms of cross-examination, well, think about what it is that you might be asked questions on. Look for the clues. Well, the clues will be in the other side's evidence. What is it that they're picking out? What is it that they seem to have particular difficulty with in terms of your evidence? All of those things are really clear key pointers as to the sorts of questions you might be asked and the sorts of challenges you might face when it comes to cross-examination. Another clue point away from the proof is, of course, the statements of common ground, because you'll have there the areas of contention. Also, when you have any CMCs with an inspector, often they will confirm at that stage what they see the main issues in the case to be. And so you'll have an indication there in terms of how any of those issues might fit with your evidence, and therefore what it is that the inspector is likely to want you to focus on. And you can think then about how you might tackle those things. Now here then, I'm just going to deal very briefly as well with virtual inquiries. I don't know how many of you have had a virtual inquiry yet, if at all. I've had a couple of them actually throughout the summer, quite luckily, because I had been in an inquiry right just before lockdown broke, and we ended up being adjourned off. And then luckily we were able to have that adjourned inquiry in the summer. And then I had another inquiry following from that, and then a return to another inquiry in September. So I've done quite a bit now of virtual inquiries. And there are positives and there are negatives to it. It's different in some aspects. You obviously aren't facing people in real life in the same way. You won't have documents within the room in the same way. You won't have members of the public there in the same way. Everything's on the screen. You feel perhaps maybe one more removed from the scenario than you ordinarily would. So those are all things to consider, I think, at the moment in terms of how you might prepare to give your evidence, because it's a different way of giving evidence than before. But really, the gist of it's the same. The process is the same in terms of, if it's traditional, you'll still be asked questions in the same way as you always would have been before. If it's a round table, it will the discussion will ensue in the same way as it used to as well. But extra things that you might want to consider then. Firstly, your location for giving evidence. Now, you could be doing it from your bedroom if you wanted to do that. It really depends. You'd need to talk to your team. The inquiries that I have done, we have taken a view to socially distance in a COVID secure office so that the team was together, albeit, of course, remote from the rest of the inquiry. And that, I have to say, does work quite well if that's something that can be safely conducted, because you're able to still have those discussions around the inquiry time that you would ordinarily have. That's one of, I think, the biggest differences between a in-person inquiry to a virtual inquiry. Also, it's easier to have instructions in that way coming to and from everybody. Otherwise, what you'll need to do is you'll have to have a very clear discussion as to how you're going to communicate with your team. I've got this as the bottom point. So WhatsApp can work very well for that. Emails are fine, but obviously if you're using the same device to access the inquiry, you need to be careful about making sure that there isn't the sound of emails coming through. So you need to make sure that you deal with your notifications properly in that regard. You also need to bear in mind as well that during you actually giving evidence, you need to make sure that it's obvious that you're not able to collude with anybody. Now, when you're in person, although you're all in the same room, everyone can see where you are and everyone can see where you are in the breaks. But virtually, that's not the case. So in my view, it's always good to have a separate witness room if you're doing it at the same location. And if you're doing it in your bedroom, that's obviously different, isn't it? Or your living room or your kitchen, like I am today. Because it's obvious that there's no one else here with me. So think about that, and you must not use WhatsApp or email or whatever it is that your decided communication type is. You must not use any of that during giving evidence, of course. I would also suggest that if you're mid-evidence and you're in Purdah, unless it's overnight, if it's during any of the break times, you might want to keep your camera on during your virtual inquiry, but with the sound obviously off, so that members of the public can see you and see that you're not talking to anybody else during your break. You just eat your sandwich on video. That's what I would do anyway, because of course it's all recorded, and if there were a challenge at any later stage, it will be seen then on the recording of the inquiry that you were just sat there eating your tuna and cucumber sandwich and not really doing very much else. Know how to use the technology and think about your setup. So where are you going to be? If, like me, you're in your kitchen right now, I need to prop my laptop up on something, because otherwise you'll be looking at a weird angle. So I'd need to think about that. I need to think about backup. So if it all goes wrong, I've got another laptop next to me. I've got my chargers, things like that you want to think about. If you are more comfortable using larger monitors, you'll need to be prepared for that. Maybe purchase another monitor or borrow one from the office or whatever your arrangements are with your employer. Just make sure that you're comfortable when you're giving your evidence and that it all works. You do have the benefit with virtual inquiries of a test event. Obviously, you really should make sure that you participate in that, because that enables you to have an opportunity to see how Microsoft Teams works, which is the mechanism for PINs running these inquiries. You'll be able to make sure that you can screen share if you want to screen share or anything like that. So make sure that you attend those. And in terms of the way that a virtual inquiry runs, it's usually 3 sets of 1.5 hour sessions during the inquiry time. It depends on the inspector though. Inspectors that I've sat with have sat late, others have been really strict in relation to keeping to those times, and you'll also have the CMC as well, so you can discuss any issues there. The other point as well, just before we move on to the final bits here, is electronic bundles will need to be provided, so you need to make sure that someone on your team who is responsible for dealing with electronic bundles knows how to prepare those correctly, so to ensure they're indexed, paginated, and that any hyperlinks that need to be there are there. Similarly, that any documentation within that bundle is uploaded to a website. So within the council, you need to discuss how that can be facilitated, because although you upload documents obviously in the ordinary way, this is different. You need to have a website that members of the public can access and download the bundle during, because there won't be the opportunity to have it within the council chamber as you ordinarily would have. Giving evidence, here we go. This is the positive slide. You can do it. You absolutely can do it. If you've not given evidence before, you don't need to worry. It is a conversation. You can view it as a conversation with the inspector, because although you're being asked questions by somebody else, it's really the inspector that matters. It's the inspector who's making the decision. If it's not the inspector making the decision, because it's the Secretary of State, the inspector's the one writing the report, so the decision can be made. So they're the most important person, and barristers will have their own agenda, won't they? They're representing the client that they're representing. So don't be put off by those that are asking the questions. Just focus on what the inspector seems to be doing, how they're responding to your answers, answer to them, communicate with them. But what else do you need to do? Well, I'm not going to tell you how to give the best evidence in terms of what you should say, because A, I can't do that, and B, I don't know your case anyway. But what I can tell you is this. There are 5 bullet points here that I think are really important. The absolute most important one, which barristers are really well known for having a lot of, is sleep. Well rested means alert. If you're giving evidence, you need to be on top of it. You need to be able to work your way around your documents nicely. You need to be able to respond to sometimes very difficult questions. So don't stay up all night and get no sleep because you're panicking. If you don't know it by the time that you need to go to bed, you're never going to know it because you'll be too panicked to take it in anyway. So make sure you get that sleep, I think is the most important thing. Make sure your tools and your setup are there for you. So not just the stuff I've spoken about in terms of virtual inquiries, but things like making sure you've got all your documents available, you've got post-it notes, you've got any notes on your evidence, you've got your stationery that you need, water, all of that stuff. It sounds really silly, but it can make a really big difference, particularly the things like having a highlighter and some post-its on your table, so that when you're being asked questions, so that you don't forget what it is that's been said or what have you, you can write a quick note about what the question is, and if there are multiple points to the question, you can make sure you've noted those, and you can tab anything whilst you're thinking of it. All really important things. Look presentable. You know, it matters in the sense that first impressions can help. You're giving evidence as an expert. You want to look like you're an expert. I think smart, clean, neat is good enough, but just make sure that you are. Confidence. You have to believe for others to believe. If you don't sound like you believe what you're saying, why would anyone else? So, you know, if this is your opinion, it's your opinion. It is what it is. I'm not saying don't make reasonable concessions if you need to do that, but what I'm saying is that you need to have conviction in what it is that you are saying. And linked to that really is delivery, the way you use your voice, your mannerisms. Don't gesticulate too much. I know I'm doing it a lot now. I'm over exaggerating it to make the point. Don't be too distracting. Give good eye contact. It's a lot harder, I have to say, with virtual inquiries to do that, because you'll have lots of faces on the screen. Sometimes you won't see all of the faces because people have their videos off like now. And it can be quite difficult, therefore, to engage or feel like you're engaging because you can't see anybody. But do your best. You can see where the camera is. Try and give that eye contact if you can. And those are all things that I think will really enhance and help your evidence. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, I am more than happy for people to ask any questions if they want to ask any. You can turn your camera on if there is anything that you want to say in particular, or if you just want to give me a nice smile, that's fine, it's always welcome. Victoria, lovely to see you.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to, because I'm not quite sure how to find the chat function now because it's a different screen, but just want to say thank you very much for giving us that helpful kind of discussion and presentation.
Thank you.
Really useful. So I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you, Victoria. It's nice to see a human being, even if I can't see you in the same room as me. So thank you for showing me your face. And Karen, thank you for showing me your face as well. And Helen. I'm not going at all mad in lockdown, I promise.
I put a comment, grant or refusal in the chat box, and I guess that's more for judicial review. If you have a grant of permission that's being challenged, it wouldn't be an inquiry, it'd be a judicial review.
Yes, that's true, and actually to that point, your evidence obviously is different in that respect, because you can't introduce new evidence unless there's really good reason, and the judge would make a decision on that anyway. So in that respect, it's more of a case of making sure that you're collating the right evidence. And in that respect, turning your attention to what the grounds are for that judicial review. So there are obvious points, just very quickly for everyone else, if you're interested. There are obvious points in terms of evidence that you'd need there in terms of a copy of the decision and any documents that led to that decision. So if it was a decision before a committee, for example, as it often is, any of the documentation that they have had, if there is any note of their deliberation, or these days, and I've had advices that I've done actually recently, where there's a full recording now of the committee discussion. And so I've painstakingly watched however many hours of discussion to pick points that I might want to raise in a JR action. So those sorts of things to think about, obviously, in terms of the documentation that you're presenting. But actually for judicial review, I think it's more a case of liaising with your legal representative on the grounds and making sure that everyone's happy with what those are, and also the prospects of them as well, so that we're realistic and we're always coming back to and revising what the prospects are, because it can change obviously throughout, can't it, before we get to court on a JR.
Yes. Thank you.
So it's nice to see your face as well.
Thanks.
All right, now everyone else is obviously in their pajamas, that's fine. It might look like I'm not in my pajamas, I'm in a sweater top, but I do appreciate it. It might look a little bit pajamified today, but hey ho. I hope you all had a good session. Those slides, I did provide them to marketing, so I don't know if they have already been emailed out, but if not, they will be emailed out to everybody. But I think the main takeaway point from today is just don't panic. I don't want to do myself out of work ever, of course, but really it's just a conversation. It really is. We're all human beings. Some of us show it more easily than others, of course, but we really are deep down only human beings, and so are you. So you know what your opinions are, you know what your views are. Just convey that in a normal conversatory way, and you can't really go wrong. And listen to what the evidence is that's coming out, and be prepared to change and adapt your views as you go. But always have that case in the back of your mind, so that you're always aware as to how whatever it is you're saying might impact things later on. Because obviously if you want to win, we always need to be thinking, don't we, about how our evidence is impacting that as it evolves.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much. Some excellent tips there, really helpful. Especially interested to hear about your experiences with the virtual hearings as well.
Yes, a lot of that going on. I have to say, I think part of the reason why I've had so many is because I was led by Christopher Youngcusin. He's very good at getting ahead in the queue for his inquiries. So I had quite a lot of virtual experience this summer and also early autumn because of that. But I also have some virtual events coming up next year. I don't know if any of you guys have got anything pending, but I have certainly only just found out the date for a virtual inquiry for an enforcement matter that's now going to be in February. And I know I was advised on that, and we put in for that all the way back at the start of the summer, I think. So I know that a lot of people are waiting a long time to get dates for virtual inquiries actually at the moment. And it does seem as though PINs are trying to give preference to certain types of certain types of proposals. Obviously, some of the more serious things, trying to deal with those first and foremost and trying to balance it out. But part of the issue, for those that don't know, is that when you have a virtual inquiry, there has to be a case officer online with you the whole time, and they also have to have tech support. So because of that, I'm sure you'll all be aware that when you deal with appeals, you'll see the same case officer names coming up again and again, communicating with you, so that they don't have that many. So if you think about it, there's therefore a very small number of inquiries that they can reasonably run with that number of case officers, and also with needing the tech support as well. So that's part of the reason why it takes a little bit longer to get a virtual inquiry. But they are very good. I personally think they're very good when they do get off the ground. And, you know, potentially you might save a bit of time. I don't know. Both of mine ended up with a bit longer time, so I'm probably not the best person to ask. Goodbye, everybody, and thank you so much.